What's up, loyal listeners, and welcome to another edition of Nervous Breakdowns with G. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about crisis, specifically why some people seem to be really good at managing crisis and some people are really sucky at it. And we're going to explore the difference between the two. So here we go.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the latest edition of Nervous Breakdowns, a podcast where your questions about relationships, dating, personality, and mental health are answered by Zinno. Gino's a nationally certified counselor with master's degrees in clinical and counseling psychology. And now, here's the man himself, Zinno.
Welcome, everyone. Episode 14 coming at you. Nervous Breakdowns with G. So, talking about crisis today. Well, we'll come back to that. So what I would like everybody to do is to go ahead and give me a follow on Twitter, at Breakdowns with G. If you have questions, if you want to join the conversation, give me some feedback. If you think what I'm saying is really cool or if you think it's really terrible, let me know. breakdownswithg@gmail.com, or you can do it through Twitter. Subscribe to this thing. I'm on iTunes. I'm on Stitcher. And you can also subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you're listening to this thing at this point, you already know where to find me. But subscribe, share, and spread the word. I would love to get some more downloads off this thing. But welcome. We are on episode 14. The podcast topic today is crisis. I've been doing mental health counseling for a long time. I got my first job in 2003, and when you work in mental health, many of you will know this because if you're listening, you might know me at this point. My listenership is not so large that you're anything more than a degree or two of separation from me. But if you work in mental health counseling, you'll know that your first job is usually going to be in a community mental health center. What that means is you're in a place where the idea is to serve a very needy population. And if you know that people who have trouble with their finances, people who aren't coming from the best backgrounds, and people who are going to be attending community mental health centers tend to live their life from one crisis to another. If you don't have a ton of money, you're going to have a crisis if your car breaks down. You're going to have a car that breaks down a lot because you can't afford to have a really reliable one. You're going to have trouble making your ends meet and paying bills. You're going to live in a bad neighborhood where there's crime. You're more likely to be traumatized. So when you work in community mental health, you get a lot of exposure to people that are coming in with a crisis, people that are coming in saying, look, something really bad is happening. I don't know how to manage it, and I really feel overwhelmed. And so when you work in that setting, it really behooves you as a counselor, as a clinician, to develop an idea about crisis. And I have developed several. And in fact, many of my work experiences have led me deeper into the crisis rabbit hole. And at this point, I'm really working in a crisis that's basically a half a step away from an emergency room. So we're seeing people that are really sometimes in the worst times of their lives. And what I see repeatedly is that some people can tolerate a crisis. They can like something bad will happen, and really the severity of the crisis is not important. An awful thing can happen to one person A, and person A will be devastated and really have a hard time recovering. The same exact thing can happen to person B, and person B, while they are affected, I mean, they're not emotionless zombies where they're not bothered by the crisis, they seem to snap back. And I think there are a lot of things that differentiate these two people. Person A may have exactly the same circumstances as person B, but there's something about them inside that makes them handle a crisis differently. I touched a little bit on this in my bullying podcast when I talk about resilience, and I think there's several qualities to resilience that factor in here, but some specifically apply more than others. And I have to say that at least no small part of this has to do with us as Americans. So I'm going to get on my soapbox for a second here. As Americans, we're almost victims of our own success. Here in the United States, we've been very fortunate that we have, decent financial means available to us. Even the poorest Americans tend to be able to feed themselves and have basic necessities met. There are exceptions, of course. There are lots of Americans that go hungry, children specifically. But by and large, we're not a country that is handling famine on a scale that some African countries might, or some of the poor parts of Asia, or some of the less politically stable parts of South America might handle. People in those countries deal with trauma and crisis on a far greater scale than we do here in America. For example, we tend not to worry about the danger of being invaded by other countries. Like we don't have foreign soldiers occupying us and shooting us if we get out of line or if we protest. So just on that scale, Americans are very fortunate that we don't have to deal with crisis the way some other places do. Furthermore, many Americans enjoy kind of relative economic prosperity. The average American doesn't do super great, and it's getting worse, especially with the recent economic conditions of the past 10 or 15 years. But the average American has a roof over their head, has decent job prospects, and if you talk to them, if you approach somebody on the street and ask them, like 100 people, what's your goal in life? I would say a lot of them, very many of them would say, my goal in life is to be happy. Not necessarily to, have kids that don't die from diseases. Again, I'm just trying to delineate what Americans deal with versus what people from really unstable and underprivileged countries deal with. Americans tend to have fewer big life-threatening problems than people in other parts of the world. But I think in many ways this has hurt us. And the reason it's hurt us is because we have an unrealistic idea about the kinds of things that we're supposed to face. We tend to think that life is generally absent of pain, is generally absent of death, and absent of suffering and illness, and a lot of things that people from other parts of the world are much more intimate with. I'm the child of immigrants. My father passed away, but my father and mother immigrated to this country in the 60s. But my dad was born in 1928, and so he was alive in Italy when Italy was a battleground, right? When Italy was a place where American soldiers had come up through from Africa, and just during World War II there was just a lot of war, and so he had experiences that the average American wouldn't have. He had enemy soldiers in his town. My mom's younger than him. She was born in the 40s, but even then she would tell me anecdotes, right? Anecdotes which would, as an American, shock me, right? She told me once that she and some friends were playing in a field when she was 7 or 8 years old, and they encountered what they thought was a bottle of some kind. It was a piece of debris. It looked like a bottle, but it was like a can with a handle on it. And her and her friends were playing with it, tossing it around, and it was an unexploded grenade, and the thing exploded. And my mom tells the story in a very matter-of-fact way. She goes, Johnny lost an eye, and Victor has a hook for a hand now, and and she even shows me on her back where she has shrapnel scars, right? And I tell that story to illustrate a point that I'm trying to make, which is that for many people, this is so far outside the reality as to be meaningless. For the vast majority of Americans, they grow up in places where there's not war on a grand scale. If there's violence, it's violence from one person to another, and it's sporadic. The only thing I can think of which might be an exception is people that grow up where there's a lot of gang warfare, and it can be very battleground-like. But I think that the average person tends not to deal with violence on this scale on a day-to-day basis. Now, for all Americans, what we see in the media and we see in our society is that death is a rarity, right? I mean, how often does a child die in the United States with our medical care? But pretty infrequently. And I mean, in fact, where our infant mortality rate is not as good as some other countries, but is better than most countries, right? We in terms of developed nations. Think about how that might compare to some place like the Congo, right? Where not only do they have violence on a kind of a disgusting scale, but also they don't have access to medical care or water or food. The likelihood of a woman having a child that lives is small, and the likelihood of her dying in childbirth is high. So people from that part of the world deal with death and dying routinely. Once again, I'm just trying to point out that in the United States, we have an idea about pain and suffering that may not be realistic. Now, how does this fit into to crisis and how we handle crisis? Generally, we take crisis personally. When somebody in our family dies, and we have to grieve the loss, very often we are insulted by it almost. Like we have a hard time getting through it because it feels like it's personal. It feels like it shouldn't happen. But the reality is everybody you know is going to die. You're going to die. If you have kids, they're going to die. Your parents are going to die, your grandparents. Anybody that you know is going to face death eventually in their life. You know, life is a sexually transmitted disease that's fatal, right? I read that somewhere. So as soon as you incorporate that, as soon as you integrate that into your worldview, crises such as death become much easier to handle. And I say that, and I remember times when people in my family have died, and it's really almost like a non-issue. I mean, you because my parents grew up in times when people were routinely hurt, and death was common. They handle it differently than many people that I know. In fact, this led to some trouble because I've integrated that myself. I've had trouble with my marriage for my in-laws because they have a much more American worldview, and so my wife has accused me of being callous about death. And I've had to explain to her that no, I feel bad, but I just I guess I recognize the reality of it. When people die, or when people live, they're going to die eventually. Okay, now let me be very clear on that last point. I am not suggesting that when you have, the worst possible thing you could imagine, like the death of a child, when that happens to you, I'm not suggesting that you should just be like, oh, well, sometimes people die and not feel anything. No, far from it. When we have loss, I think that we need to feel it. I think that we need to feel the pain of that person being gone. I think we need to miss them. I think we need to go through the process, the stages of grief that we talk about, right? But I think what differentiates the person, like I said at the top of the show, what differentiates the person that can deal with that and come out the other end, and what as opposed to the person that kind of, and we all know people like this that have lost somebody and they never recovered, is the idea that something unfair has happened, right? Like if you have a child that dies, look, that's sad, it's tragic, sure, but kids die sometimes, right? Kids are mortal, and kids get sick and they die, and it's not a personal affront, right? It's something that sucks so hard, but by the same token, sometimes it happens, and if you can't allow your worldview to accept that reality, that sometimes kids die, you're not going to be able to deal with crisis very well, which is the whole point of this episode today. So I guess let's jump into the whole idea of how we do deal with crisis well. Again, talking back to some of the resilient points is the idea that sometimes bad things happen to people, right? It's not abnormal. It's not wrong. It's not unfair. It's not any of these value judgments. It just is. The vast majority of times, you're going to have neutral experiences. Then sometimes good things are going to happen, and sometimes bad things are going to happen. But for most people, you're going to end up somewhere in the middle, right? Like when you take the average of the good stuff that happens and the bad shit that happens, you'll even out. You'll have a kind of a neutral existence, which is why I go back to the idea that Americans have this need to feel happy. I think that that's so unrealistic. How can you feel happy all the time? It's impossible. You cannot have happiness all the time. It becomes meaningless. I think that your life should be neutral for the most part, except for the peaks and the valleys, right? So you should aim for the feeling that you have when you're tying your shoes in the morning, which is you're just kind of focusing on the matter at hand. You're not necessarily stressed out. You're not necessarily elated about anything. But you just are. You're doing the thing that you need to do. That should be your baseline. So having the understanding that sometimes bad things happen and it's a part of life and it's normal, is important. I think that's a big part of handling crisis well. The other part of handling crisis well is the understanding that sometimes good things happen, right? Sometimes when we have a bad thing that happens to us, we feel like that's going to be the rest of our life, that we have hit a low and the low is never going to go away. But a crisis is by definition a temporary thing. Okay? Once it stops being temporary, it stops being a crisis. So if you lose your job and you can never find another job, well, you're not in a crisis anymore. You're just permanently unemployed. And you can deal with that. You can either accept that and kind of decide to live that life, or you can do what it takes to get out of that life. But it has to stop being a crisis after a certain point. Also, the understanding that things are temporary can give you some light at the end of the tunnel, right? Especially when we deal with things like death. Now, I don't mean to suggest that death is temporary. I mean, obviously, somebody's gone, they're gone. But you're not going to grieve for the rest of your life. I've experienced deaths. I've experienced the deaths of close people. I just mentioned my father died, right? And in the days and weeks and months after his death, it was awful. I felt like a piece of me was missing all the time, right? But think about it. 6 months later, was I thinking about him every day? Not every day. And when I thought about him, did I cry? No, not 6 months later. After 6 months, I was able to think about him and feel sad for sure. I mean, I'm kind of feeling sad now talking about it, but I don't feel the need. It's not that sharp kind of intense pain that I felt the day after or the day of his death. And I think that that's part of normal grieving, right? Where you're always going to have the loss, you're going to have the feeling of sadness that person's no longer in your life, but the crisis feeling of it, that kind of a crushing, grinding sadness that you get in the days and weeks after somebody dies, that goes away. And if you can recognize that, and you can apply past experiences to a current experience, like if I lose somebody else now, I feel comfortable in the knowledge that the bad feeling that I have in the immediate days and weeks after the death are going to go away. And I know that from my experience, that I've had other losses, and those losses have been easier to bear over time. Right there, the idea that your crisis is temporary makes an immediate and a very basic shift, a very basic change in the way we visualize crisis. I've sat in therapy sessions with clients that tell me, and these are clients, for example, who may have a parent that's critically ill, right? They may have an elderly, like an 80-year-old, 85-year-old parent that is in the end stages of cancer, and they're sitting with me and telling me, I don't know what I'm going to do when my mom dies. And I hate to have to do this, but there are times when I have to say, well, let's start thinking about it. Right? Because even if your mom doesn't die from this, she's gonna die. Now that may sound cold because again, as Americans, we don't hear that often, but it's a reality, right? As a counselor, I don't do my clients any favors by fluffing them or sugarcoating them or telling them something that's not true. what I encourage them to do is engage, to think about, use their brain and think about what it's going to feel like. And the reason I do that is because I want to enlighten them. I want to show them that you're going to feel bad, right? Your mom's going to die. You're going to feel like shit. But that feeling is not permanent. That feeling is going to be there for a while. Or, just the way I described it, 6 months, a year later, 10 years later, when you think about your mom, are you going to feel sad? Yes, of course. But it's, again, not that soul-crushing, grinding sadness that you have in the days immediately following the loss. And what this does is it turns the crisis from a brick wall that you can't see past, right, to something where, if you're traveling on a road, it's a bump, some bumps in the road, but the road beyond the bumps exists and you can see it. That attitude is what I think firmly differentiates the person that can handle crisis and the person that can't. The idea that there's no life after the crisis makes somebody fail at handling crisis. In order to do this, in order to get through a crisis, you have to believe that you're going to go through it and you're going to come out of it. And at the end of it, you're going to be changed, maybe not, but you're going to be. You're going to exist and life will go on. I had a professor. I recently went back to school and I got another degree. I have 2 master's degrees. I got the degree in counseling that allows me to be licensed in my state, okay? And so I had the opportunity to return to school with a different set of eyes, with the eyes of somebody that has been practicing the field and the craft or whatever you want to call it for several years. And I was able to return and kind of have a better understanding of what's important and what's not. And I had a professor who was, some of you who know me will know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not going to mention his name, but he was a very bright guy, but very scattered. And so when he would give lessons and instructions, you almost had to kind of find you had to find the needle in the haystack of the really important pieces of what he said. But one of the things that he said, which was profound in a crisis counseling class, was a crisis is somebody's opportunity to redefine themselves. And I had a hard time wrapping my head around that at first, but I understand now what he was talking about. We live in lives in which we define ourselves, right? So let's say I am married and I have a certain set of roles in my marriage. So I'm the guy that cuts the grass. I'm the guy that brings in the mail. I'm the guy that drives my wife to the train station in the morning. And so I define myself by the things that I do. And somewhere along the line, my wife takes ill and she dies. Now she also has her role. So she is the one that cooks the meals, that pays the bills, that does the grocery shopping. And she passes. Of course, now I'm going to have the soul-crushing, grinding grief that I described, right? But I'm going to be faced with a choice very quickly or very soon after her death. And my choice is going to be this. Am I going to continue to define myself as the person who does these particular tasks and who is missing their counterpart? Or am I going to define myself as the person who learned how to cook meals, learned what bills to pay, learned how to grocery shop? This is the change that happens after crisis. We have to say, am I going to be the person that never was the same again? Or am I going to be the person that learned how to live with this loss? And it happens consciously. We see it all the time. We see it when the person who has had a loss makes the decision, I'm ready to go back out, right? When they make that decision, they're saying, I'm ready to be a person again. I'm ready to be maybe a new kind of person, maybe a person that I wasn't before, but a person. We also see it when people don't make that decision, right? When we see people have a loss and they just decide that they're going to shut down, that they can never be again because the person that they've lost or the job that they lost or the crisis they experienced or the trauma, the rape or sexual abuse has changed them in such a fundamental way that they can't be people anymore. This is a tough one, and this has to do with resilience. I think that part of dealing with crisis is having some of these foundational things in place. Like I mentioned before, when you have the belief that, look, sometimes bad stuff happens to people. Sometimes people can do all the right things. You can be a good person. If you're religious, you can go to church, pray, follow all the rules. You can pay your taxes, give money to charity, and life will shit on you sometimes. Because what you do doesn't necessarily, there's not a straight line, a direct line from what you do to the things that happen to you. Sometimes shit just happens. Okay? And if somebody doesn't have that at the beginning, they're going to have a hard time making that decision to become a person again after the crisis, right? Sometimes bad shit just happens. If I have a significant loss in my life and I have that belief, sometimes bad shit just happens, I'm going to at one time, once I've dealt with it, with the kind of immediate feelings, once I've dealt with the acute pain of the loss, I'm going to be able to remind myself, hey, sometimes shit just happens. And you know what? I'm still here. So I can either live my life with this loss and especially if it's a death, I can be what this person might have wanted me to be, or I could live my life and be a waste and suffer day in and day out until it's time for me to go. But guys, this is really, especially for some of my counselor friends that might be listening to this right now, this is really where the art of our field comes in, is that when as a counselor do you start to confront some of these things, right? I mean, especially in where I'm seeing somebody in my setting, I may not be with them very long. I see somebody for, a month, a couple of weeks, and they're still in that acute kind of soul-crushing pain that I described. That's not the time. I don't think that's the time to say, hey, when are you going to get over this? No, I think that sometimes as a counselor, I have to just kind of sit with somebody and feel it with them, which is hard. It's rough. It's definitely hard because you want to help them move through it. But when you see somebody for longer, you kind of have to use your judgment and say, all right, listen, we've been meeting for a long time now, and this person is gone to you, right? So when are you gonna? Is this gonna be your life now? Is this how you want to be? When are you gonna make the choice to live a life? What do you want your life to be like, and how can we get there? It's rough. It's rough because people push back, man. Like, people don't want to hear that when they're feeling pain. They're like, well, what do you mean? I shouldn't feel anything about losing my kid or the fact that I was molested or what? And it's like, no, that's not. But that's not what you're saying. You're saying, yeah, you should feel something. It sucks. It feels bad, right? But how long are you gonna let it define you? How long are you gonna let it crush your life and limit your ability to move forward? That's the hard part. But that's where the healing happens, right? The healing happens when you as a person can deal with a crisis and say, look, yeah, I feel it. I feel pain right now. And one day I'm not. One day I'm not going to feel pain. And it's not going to be some, magic thing a therapist says to me. It's not going to be some breakthrough. It's going to be a gradual process. I'm going to have good days. I'm going to have bad days. I may not even notice the change. But one day I'm going to sit and I'm going to have committed myself to living the life that I want and go back to school or keep looking for work or try to date again or try to have another kid, whatever it is. And I'm going to look back and I'm going to say, yeah, I was really messed up right after that happened. And in the doing in the act of doing my life, of being the person I want to be, I've met with some healing, right? I've come through and I've become a person that's pushed through pain and dealt with it and gotten closer to how I want my life to be. And I think that some of the things I mentioned are so important when it comes to making yourself feel better, being able to deal with crisis. Again, I mean, just to summarize, just the idea that understanding that sometimes bad things just happen to people, and also that all things are temporary. The Buddhists have it right, I think, when it comes to mental health and just counseling and dealing with suffering. They just believe, look, suffering is a part of life. Everything is temporary. But the part that people don't understand is that in Buddhism, they even believe that you're temporary from moment to moment. The person I am as I'm saying this word right now is different than the person I am as I'm saying this word right now. So I can make a choice between the first word and the second word to be a different person, and I will be. My past self doesn't really impact my future self. It's tricky. I mean, it's definitely, you could probably argue with me, oh, yeah, sure you don't. You try to tell that to an ex-con that's trying to get a job. I mean, yeah, society has trouble with that. But within yourself, you can make the choice to be whoever you want to be and simply be that person as long as you follow through with the actions associated with that. And if you want to be the person who handles crisis well, then do the things that people who handle crisis well do, and you will. If you think you can handle crisis well or you think you can't, you're probably right. So I have done 30 minutes now on this topic, and I am very interested in hearing what you guys have to say about it. So as I said, please shoot me an email. I'm happy to hear your thoughts. If you have a crisis you want to share with me and tell me how you handled it and what you did to get through it, I want to hear it. My email is breakdownswithg@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter. Share this with your friends on Twitter at breakdownswithg. I have my Tumblr page, breakdownswithg.tumblr.com. And, of course, subscribe to me, iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher Radio. Download the Stitcher app. If you have a mental health issue that you need some help with, please visit samhsa.gov, SAMHSA.gov. This is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration website. If you live in Central Jersey and you need some counseling, come and check me out. I'm in at bewellnj.com, and you can certainly give us a call. They accept most insurances there, and I'm happy to help you out. So, thank you very much for listening, guys, and we'll see you next time.